Well, the task of solving Australia's energy problems falls largely on the Federal Energy and Environment Minister, Josh Frydenberg. He joined us earlier. Josh Frydenberg, thank you for your time. Just following on from Tom Iggulden's story there, is now the time to be taking away compensation for the carbon tax when electricity prices are at record highs?
Well, as you know, we abolished the carbon tax, and this saw the greatest recorded drop in electricity prices ever, and that's been very significant. We're looking at a number of other ways to reduce the electricity prices that have been rising, as you say, in recent years, and I'm pursuing those initiatives through the COAG Energy Council.
I just want to read you something from the National Energy Security Assessment of 2009, which warned of, quote, the need for further supply and demand side market reforms to improve the flexibility and resilience of energy markets in the face of disruptions or structural change. What concrete steps has your government made to address these issues, these warnings, since taking government 4 years ago in 2013?
Well, obviously we see the need for more gas into the market, and the states have placed moratoriums and bans on both conventional and unconventional gas, so we continue to push that forward. We have made some changes through the COAG Energy Council to the transportation of gas, which will help lower electricity prices. We're focusing heavily on energy security and the stability of the system, and that's why we've commissioned Alan Finkel, Australia's chief scientist, to come back to us with a number of recommendations, but we've already implemented some changes to ensure that there's less pressure on the interconnectors and other parts of the system which have been stressed at a time of a high uptake of intermittent power. But ultimately what we're trying to do, David, is coordinate a national policy to energy, and we've seen the biggest change in more than 100 years with the move from traditional synchronous-based generation, particularly coal, but also gas, to a more decentralised system where the power is increasingly intermittent, namely wind and solar. And when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, power's not being generated. This is creating really significant changes for us, which we're still dealing with.
So why has it taken 8 years? I know the 4 years you weren't in power, but why is this only happening now?
Well, I think state and federal governments of all political persuasions probably didn't see the significance of these changes that were occurring in the system.
But I just read you the warning from 2009. There's been warnings ever since.
Yeah, and obviously there is still a lot to do, but both the states and the federal government need to work very closely together here, because the system is transforming rapidly, and what we've seen in South Australia with 4 blackouts in as many months is a real crisis there, and that's why we're calling on the state government to take more responsibility for ensuring that the integration of renewables into the system is a lot more stable, is a lot more considered, and that's why we've accelerated through ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation investment in pumped hydro and other battery storage projects, because if you are going to stabilise the system, you do need to be able to store the intermittent sources of power more readily than we currently do.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that pumped hydro technology that you've mentioned there, and it seems so is the Prime Minister. A couple of weeks ago at the Press Club, he had this to say.
Last week, at my request, ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation agreed to work together on a new funding round for large-scale storage and other flexible capacity projects, including pumped hydro.
So he's talking there about taxpayer subsidies for pumped hydro. How much money is on the table to look at this?
Well, we've just announced a new round of around $20 million to investigate various projects for pumped hydro, and your listeners may be interested to know that 97% of the storage for renewables around the world is in these pumped hydro systems. Now, we only have 3 projects that are up and running in Australia. One's a large one, which is in the Snowy Hydro scheme, which is around 1,500 megawatts. There's a 500 megawatt one in relation to Wivenhoe Dam in Queensland, and then there's also another one south of Sydney that's only 240 megawatts. Now, those three projects need to be expanded upon, and that's why we're in daily discussions with ARENA, with the CFC, with interested parties to look at opportunities to find these projects. And we've also tasked the ANU to map out throughout Australia potential sites for these pumped hydro systems.
The problem is this sort of investment, although welcome in investigating things like pumped hydro, won't lead to a solution anytime soon. We've got the South Australian Premier flagging urgent action to address the instabilities in his state's power grid, which may indicate more gas plants, or at least the building of at least one gas plant in South Australia. Would the Commonwealth help by chipping in to build a new gas plant, if that is indeed needed, to keep the lights on in that state?
It's true they need more gas, and gas is in quite a tight market now, particularly because we export so much of our gas. But of course, if South Australia is pushing hard to get more gas into the system, we'd be very interested to hear what they have to say. But
that's one of the absurdities, though, when it comes to gas. By 2021, Australia will be the biggest exporter of liquefied national gas on the planet. Yet we're facing a gas shortage in this country, and there's been talk of importing gas to Australia. How has it been allowed to get to this point?
Well, isn't that ironic that the importation of gas is now being looked at, and that's why it's so important to lift these moratoriums and bans, because, David, we have an abundance of gas in Australia. In fact, in the Northern Territory alone, they have sufficient unconventional gas reserves to power Australia's domestic needs for 180 years. But we're just not being able to get out of the ground.
That's the gas in the ground onshore. What about the gas offshore, which the federal government has control over?
Well, obviously, there are some very sensitive sites, like the Great Australian Bight, which has been talked about, and we won't compromise on important environmental considerations just to pull that gas out of the offshore surrounds. And that's why NOPSEMA, which is the independent body which brings together both state and federal responsibilities, will very carefully look at any application. But we do have a lot of unconventional gas onshore, and we need to get that out of the ground.
Okay, another apparent absurdity from where I sit, the Prime Minister talking about the need to be agnostic when it comes to energy solutions. What about nuclear? We have uranium in abundance. We have one of the most stable geological plates on the planet, huge areas of desert that are uninhabited. Why is nuclear not on the table?
Well, I actually mentioned this, David, in my maiden speech in the Parliament. I said, it was quite amusing, so to speak, to see that Australia, that had about 1/3 of the world's uranium reserves, 80% of which actually exist in South Australia, but we export it to more than 20 countries, but we don't use it ourselves.
But you're the minister now. It's not your maiden speech anymore. Why don't you do something about it?
Well, the difficulty here is the politics. The difficulty here is that you would need bipartisan support to get a domestic nuclear power industry. And we've seen in South Australia when a Labor Premier tried to even look just at a nuclear waste depository, not even nuclear power, he faced very strong opposition. So this is something that should be investigated further, but it would need bipartisan support, and it would actually have a long-dated time frame which may not solve our immediate issues.
Well, as you know, it's this lack of bipartisanship across the board in energy policy that has caused so many of the problems that we're now facing. We have business, community groups, environment groups all coming out urging all sides of politics to actually come together for once on this policy. It seems that the closest we came to bipartisanship was for a couple of days late last year when there was talk of an emissions intensity scheme, which was quickly taken off the table because of what appears to be the ideologies in your own party. Yet the Prime Minister is saying we've got to take the ideology out of it. What are ordinary Australians meant to think?
Well, there was bipartisanship just 18 months ago when Labor and Liberal and National parties came together to agree on a 23.5% renewable energy target by 2020. And the Labor Party at the time described that as restoring investor confidence. The problem, David, is that they've jumped the gun now to go to a 50% renewable energy target without doing any modelling, without working out what the costs or the implications is for the stability of the grid. And we've seen in South Australia that a 50% renewable energy target is very damaging, but we've also seen Queensland adopt, bizarrely, a 50% target and Victoria a 40% target. And thank goodness my coalition colleagues in those states have now rejected those state-based targets. So what we would say to the Labor Party is we're happy to reach across the aisle and get some agreement around energy policy, but we're not going to follow you into the dark with a 50% renewable energy target, with the forced closure of coal-fired power stations, with nearly a doubling of our Paris target, which is already a stretch and already going to be a significant one for Australia to meet, and with an emissions intensity scheme, which Penny Wong herself, when she was the climate change minister back in 2009, described as a mongrel and a smokescreen and not a credible alternative.
Forgive me, but it sounds like you're saying we'll go with bipartisanship as long as you see it our way.
Well, obviously we're the government, David, and we have the primary responsibility for developing our energy plan.
But governments change. I mean, this is the problem. They change every 6 years or so on average. Yet energy policy has to be for decades. That's why we need this bipartisanship.
And that's why it's such a challenging area, because you also throw in the states and they have overlapping responsibilities too. But the point for us as a government is we've set out our key criteria and our key objectives. It's energy security, followed by affordability as we transition to a lower emissions future. We believe we can do so in a technology neutral way to the best satisfaction and outcomes for the Australian people.
Josh Frydenberg, I don't envy the task that you have. I really appreciate you speaking to us tonight.
Good to be with you, David.